Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a truly fascinating document to unpack today, one that tries to tackle some of the most intense moral and religious friction of our time. We're looking at a letter written by Ilagias Harpasos. Now, he identifies as a Messianic Jew, a child of Abraham, and he's addressing this letter directly to Protestant pastors. His ultimate goal here? He wants to bridge the gap between ancient Jewish heritage and modern Christian audiences. It's a dense, deeply layered text for sure, but we're going to break it down and discover exactly how his profound historical argument flows. Right off the bat, Harpasos expresses this genuine sorrow over the state of today's loud, combative debates. He writes, "In the midst of the strife and the clamor, both sides do fundamentally miss the mark." You see, he isn't writing to cheerlead for one specific faction over another. Instead, he makes this bold claim that the current discourse is entirely missing the point. He's challenging his readers to step back and look at these complex issues through a much older historical lens. So, here's our roadmap for today. 1. A letter to pastors. 2. Sanctity of the unborn. 3. Defending the Talmud. 4. Yeshua and oral tradition. And 5. Echoes in the Gospels. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, a letter to pastors. And moving to Section 2, Sanctity of the Unborn. Here's where Harpasos pivots directly into a pretty intense moral conversation. Writing as a child of Abraham, he argues that weaponizing the charge of anti-Semitism to shut down talks about preborn human rights is completely disingenuous. He believes you simply cannot use historical Jewish heritage as a shield to evade discussions on human rights, mainly because that ancient tradition actually treats the developing child with immense reverence. To build this rationale, he turns straight to the ancient texts. Take the prophet Jeremiah, for example, who wrote, "Before I formed thee in the belly I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb I sanctified thee." Harpasos uses this to show that historically, the developing child is recognized and sanctified in Scripture long before birth. And he points out that this reverence builds even further in the Psalms. He anchors his stance using the famous words of King David, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works." Harpasos emphasizes that David is literally singing about the child in the womb as a divine handiwork. For him, this proves that within the historic tradition, the unborn is undeniably viewed through a lens of profound sanctity and wonder. So, wrapping up his point here, Harpasos concludes that the unborn is not some empty void of moral consequence, but a soul known and sanctified by the Creator. For anyone observing these modern debates, his takeaway is clear. You cannot use historical Jewish heritage as a moral blank check for abortion. He roots his defense of the defenseless entirely in these ancient texts, urging readers to defend life with truth, rather than creating theological caricatures that ignore the very roots of the faith. Moving right along, Section 3, Defending the Talmud. Now, you might be wondering, why is he vigorously defending the Talmud against critics who dismiss it as a book of wickedness? Well, it really comes down to understanding what the book actually is. He defines it not as a single, unified doctrine, but as a vast historical archive. Think of it almost like an ancient, sprawling legal encyclopedia. It is absolutely full of debates, arguments, and crucially, dissenting minority opinions. Harpasos is trying to shift our perspective away from modern theological caricatures, helping us see the Talmud for what it really is, a complex, dialectic framework of historical debate, rather than some monolithic rulebook. But what about those highly controversial passages concerning a figure named Yeshu suffering in the afterlife? In a really fascinating postscript, Harpasos argues that these are textbook defensive reactions against early Christianity, not a core summary of the Jewish faith. And he points out a genuinely surprising fact here: the timelines are wildly out of sync. These texts often place figures named Yeshu a full 100 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. So reducing this massive, complex archive down to a few isolated, reactive polemics completely fails to grasp the historical text. Which brings us to Section 4, Yeshua and oral tradition. This is where we hit a really critical historical question. Did Yeshua literally quote the Talmud as a written book? It's a fantastic question that gets right to the heart of the historical context, and it totally changes how we view the environment he actually taught in. Well, the answer is actually just a matter of simple chronology. During the 1st century, the life of Yeshua, the physical text didn't even exist. The core text of the Talmud, the Mishnah, wasn't codified until the year 200 CE. And the extensive commentaries, the Gemara,
weren't compiled until around 500 CE. So, literally speaking, no way. He could not have quoted a book that wasn't written yet. It simply wasn't possible.
But, and this is a big but, that absolutely does not mean he wasn't engaging with the material. Harpasosis introduces this concept called Torah Shabbal Peh. This was the live-action oral tradition of first-century Israel. Yeshua was completely immersed in this dynamic, spoken environment. This lively, rigorous oral tradition was the exact bedrock of what would eventually become the written Talmud. He wasn't separated from this world, he was breathing its very air.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, Echoes in the Gospels.
Harpasos lays out some striking evidence here, showing Yeshua engaging directly with this exact stream of tradition. The parallels are honestly fascinating. Take Master Hillel's ancient debate on the Golden Rule. It perfectly mirrors Matthew 7:12. What about the intense rabbinic debates between the schools of Shammai and Hillel regarding divorce? Well, that is exactly what the Pharisees test Yeshua on in Matthew 19. And early debates about Sabbath loopholes, like saving a beast in distress, they show up identically in Matthew 12. These aren't just coincidences, folks. They are direct historical footprints.
It's like a historical puzzle falling right into place. When Yeshua disputed with the religious leaders of his day, he wasn't just speaking in a vacuum. He was actively using the exact same legal arguments, phrasing, and rhetorical logic that the rabbis would eventually write down centuries later. He was walking, teaching, and disputing within that very same stream of tradition. Recognizing this completely transforms how we visualize his interactions with the scholars of his time.
Bringing it all together, what is Harpasos' overarching plea to his readers? First, we must defend life with pure truth. Second, we cannot reduce complex religious history to inaccurate soundbites or vain talk. And third, we must not condemn the heritage of the fathers based on basic misunderstandings. Instead, we have to seek understanding with wisdom, realizing that these texts and traditions actually share a rich, deeply connected history.
And I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. If Harpasos is right and these ancient texts and traditions are truly this intertwined, how does understanding this stream of tradition change the way you read your foundational religious text today? It certainly challenges us to look past the surface and seek the deeper historical truth. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.